What do you think? Should we start? Today we're going to learn to make Italian rainbow cookies, which are my favorite cookies. I've never made these before because they always seemed way too complicated and really intimidating, but I figured there's no time like the present to learn to make your favorite cookie, right? It's a cookie. Like, they're not scary. They are a little. The first thing you're going to want to do is crack your eggs, separating the egg yolks from the egg whites into 2 bowls. Crack the egg and let the egg white spill out into your egg white bowl, and then scoop the yolk back and forth between the eggshell halves to get all the egg white out, and then dump the yolk into another bowl. Next, I measured out a 1/4 cup of oat milk because that was the milk that I wanted to use. Then I measured out a cup of sugar and threw it into my mixing bowl without really thinking too much about whether that was the first thing to go in. Turns out it is. I also forgot where all the outlets were. Next, I softened the first of my 3 sticks of butter in the microwave. I didn't actually time this and I ended up with mostly melted butter. Really, I should have taken the butter out earlier before I started cooking, and then it would have been nice and soft. If you're using like a KitchenAid mixer, for this part, you use like the paddle attachment. If you're doing it by hand, you can just use a spoon. Next, I struggled to open my package of almond paste and plopped it in the mixer bowl on top of the sugar. I put the butter in on top of the sugar and the almond paste. The butter did stick in the middle of the mixer paddle a bit, so I had to scrape it out every once in a while. Then I very smartly unwrapped the next 2 sticks of butter and popped them in the microwave, and promptly forgot about them. Once everything was kind of like smooth, I threw in my egg yolks and milk, and then I remembered that I forgot to open my container of almond extract, so I struggled with that for a second and then measured out 2 teaspoons and threw them into the bowl too. Then you combine everything till it's this nice, smooth thing. Next, I measured out 2 cups of flour, and I probably should have done this before I started because it just made the whole process a lot more stressful than it needed to be, but you know, I don't know if this is the right way to measure out flour, but it's the way my mom always yells at me to do it, where you scoop it 1 spoonful at a time into the measuring cup and then scrape off the top. Whenever I try to just go in there and scoop it, she's like, no, it's just a motherly instinct, I guess. I don't know if that's what that is. After I added my flour, I checked my recipe and realized that I had in fact forgotten to put in the 2 other softened sticks of butter, so I threw them in last minute. Then I took the batter out of the mixer and into a different bowl because I needed to use the same mixer bowl to whisk the egg whites. If you have another bowl for your mixer, you don't need to do this part, but I didn't. It worked. Once I got the almond situation into another bowl, I had to pop over to the sink and wash the mixer bowl so that I could whisk my eggs happily. Really clean, I grabbed my balloon whisk, regular whisk, I don't know, whisking attachment, and attach it. Toss the egg whites into the bowl and just start whisking, and it's going to whisk for a long, long time. It's not really that long. It took about 10 minutes. Just a great opportunity to clean your kitchen, contemplate life, watch the eggs slowly become more solid over time. You could dance, you could sing, you could play with your dog, write a novel, do something until when the mixer passes through them, they sort of keep their shape. And then you're going to fold the egg whites into your almond stuff. At first I was a little bit concerned about over mixing my egg whites in, and I tried to be really gentle, but it turns out I'm not a very gentle folder. Nothing seems to have collapsed. It's pretty resilient. Next, I grabbed 3 bowls and a handy dandy kitchen scale to separate the almond batter into 3 even bowls. I managed to get exactly 402 grams into each bowl, and that I think is quite an achievement because this batter is really sticky, very hard to navigate it into new things. It worked out eventually. Next, I grabbed my sheet pan and lined it with parchment paper because that part I followed out of the directions. I only used 1 sheet pan to cook my cookies because I couldn't be bothered to rotate them out. I should have. Then I set my oven to 325. I figured it would take a while to mix the food coloring and stuff. I started out with a 1/4 teaspoon of each of the green and red food coloring, but I ended up adding some number of extra drops in to get to the right level of vibrancy. Your mileage may vary, and I suggest you just follow your heart. Next, I grabbed my sheet pan and contemplated my choices of trying to use the same sheet pan for all 3 colors, and I smooshed the batter in to fill the available space. I split it roughly into thirds. It was really annoying. The batter is hard to smoosh around. I had to clean my spatula thing a couple of times. I also realized partway through this process that the butter sweetener that I had thrown in at the last minute. It didn't quite break down enough, so I ended up with butter chunks all through my cake. Who doesn't like a good butter chunk, right? Next time I do this, I will actually do each cake individually because I will end up with neater layers. The cake will bake in the same amount of time. The recipe said it would take about 10 minutes to bake the cakes. Mine had to bake for 30 minutes. If I had just rotated out the cakes and used the same pan between layers, then it would have taken the same amount of time. So I really didn't save anything by doing this. After your cake is baked, take it out of the oven and let it cool completely. I abandoned mine on the counter for about 3 hours. Next, I took my apricot jam and spread it across my green segment. I realized they were not quite even, and so I measured out with my hand in a very precise sort of way so that I knew where to stop each jam. It took me a lot longer than I thought it was going to do this part. I was like, oh, easy, spread some jam on some cake. What could possibly take a long time? It turns out it's just really goddamn tedious. I put the green one down first, continued my raspberry jam spreading on the cake-colored cake, and then I cut that one out. Realized that I should have stacked it first, so I had to sort of finagle it on top of the other layer, unjammed side down. Once I got that figured out, I took the final piece and just plopped it right on top. With your cake stack assembled, you're going to cover it with something heavy and put it in the fridge for at least 4 hours. I just did mine overnight because it was late. In the morning, I rescued my cake and started melting down the chocolate. I improvised a double boiler with a mixing bowl, and I was quite proud because it had a little handle. I melted down the chocolate until it was nice and loosey-goosey and spread it along the layer of cake that was on the top. This part is pretty straightforward. Doing it in small globs and just spreading it out a little bit was a lot better because it would start to like solidify and pull the cake with it when I went to move. With the top of the cake covered in chocolate, I plopped it back in the fridge for 30 minutes to let the chocolate solidify, and then when that was done, I took it out, flipped it over, and repeated the process on the back side of the cake, and then threw it back in the fridge for about 30 more minutes. Once the chocolate is set, rescue your dessert from the fridge one more time, flip it over so that the pink layer is on top because I think that's the way it's supposed to be, and then cut right into the middle to get that glamour shot. At this point, just chop up your cake into cookies of the size you want. I was aiming for the traditional thin rectangle, but my cookies are really tall and they ended up being sort of like cubes. I also realized about partway through that if I dunk my knife into hot water, it makes cutting through the hardened chocolate way easier, so that's where all those drips of water are coming from. Once that's done, you can take pictures of your work because you're really proud of yourself and you didn't think you could do it, and then you did. That's pretty much it. They took about a day and change. I made some mistakes, but ultimately, the destination was delicious even if the journey was not perfect. The recipe is just complicated enough that I won't replace every meal with these cookies, which I think is probably a good thing. You can find the recipe that I sort of used below. A couple of changes that I made. I didn't use unsalted butter because I never do, and I used oat milk, like I said, instead of regular milk. I don't think it matters too much. I used 1 pan instead of 3. That caused some issues. The recipe also only says to use raspberry jam, but I looked at a bunch of different recipes and I found that some of them call for 2 flavors. For some reason in my head, the traditional ones have 2 flavors, so that's what I did, and it came out really good, so good luck in your cookie making endeavors. That's it. If intros are awkward, closings are even more awkward, so I'm gonna grab my dog. Readiness? Yes, good girl.